I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Judy Wertheim from the Council on Adult and Experiential Learning, or better known as CAEL. She is the Vice President for Higher Education at that organization and has behind her, if you look at her bio, a very strong record of working in the fields of adult learning, prior learning assessment, and all sorts of things for which she was responsible in her past experience as dean. We really think of Judy as one of our own. She has been with the consortium almost since inception, I believe. She was at our very first founding conference and played such an important role there in helping us understand what the national landscape was for adult learning and for prior learning assessment in particular. So I'm introducing her as our friend and colleague, I think, rather than as a vice president for another organization. Also, I want to extend a welcome to our panel, and they're going to be sort of responding to Judy's address about how we create adult learning-centered practices and processes on our campus. Rebecca Jean-Baptiste is our grants research manager, and she's going to talk about how we might be able to use that as some data points for our reports. I think that will be maybe her focus. Cherie Lawrence from Fort Valley State has been a very active participant in our data collection efforts. And Candy Perry, as always, is extremely active, and she's one of our veterans from way back. So thank you, Candy, and I'll turn it over to Judy.
I hope this works. Thank you, Trish. That was a lovely introduction, and I do have to say it's good to be back among friends, and I know a lot of you, and I hope that I get to meet those of you whom I don't know yet. It's great to be here and also to find out how far Georgia has come since the inception of this project. As part of the project, many of you in your institutions have administered to your students the ALFI surveys. That's the ALFI toolkit, developed by CAEL and CHEMS, the National Center for Higher Education Management Systems, and Noel Levitt's, the testing organization. It was developed in the beginning of the 2000s, and many of you have administered it. But I have a feeling that for some of you, maybe very few, but for a few of you, the report has sat on a shelf and you haven't quite known what to do with the data that you received. So today I'm going to help you dig through the data and find out what to do with it. Those of you who have not administered the ALFI and don't know what I'm talking about, don't worry. I'm going to give you a little introduction. I hope I can touch all bases for all people as we move through these slides. ALFI, as I said, is the Adult Learning Focused Institution Toolkit. And from its beginning, we have seen that colleges can take specific steps in instruction, assessment of prior learning, and student services to improve access, retention, and success. What we're talking about is recruitment, retention, and graduation for our adult learners. Certainly important following on the heels of a presentation that's part of Complete College Georgia. ALFI does help institutions, help students to graduate. Started in the late 1990s. CAEL realized that there were some institutions that were doing very well in serving adult learners. What was it they were doing? And so CAEL engaged in several studies to try to identify what institutions were doing to help their adult learners. What they identified were 8 principles, and they named these the 8 principles of effectively serving adult learners. You don't need to take notes. What I'll do is send Marielle in the slides, and then you can have them available for people so that nobody has to take notes. I know that we all can count, and we all see that there are 9 listed, and I only talked about 8. That's true. In the beginning, we identified 8 principles for serving adult learners. In 2004, 2007, CAEL was funded by Lumina Foundation to look at the ALFI principles, particularly among community colleges. We looked at 26 adult learner programs in 25 community colleges, and we identified a 9th principle. That's why there are 9 principles. We identified transitions, and even though transitions was identified for the 2-year institutions, we and our consultants and researchers felt that it applied to 4-year institutions as well. These are the principles. They are defined on the CAEL website, and I will go through them quickly here. Outreach is the first, and this means, does the institution go beyond traditional ways of offering its education? For example, does it help break the barriers of time, place, tradition? More and more that means, does the institution use technology? Oklahoma is a state that we heard about a few minutes ago, and for many years, Oklahoma and the State Board of Regents website in Oklahoma has talked about outreach specifically for adult learners, making information available at any time that adult learners want to find that information. So outreach takes in a wide variety of ways that the institution goes beyond its typical borders to engage adult learners. The next principle is life and career planning. We know that a lot of adults are interested in returning to school or going to school for the first time because they see it related to their career and what they would like to do in life. How does their education relate to that career? Which is not to say that every single course needs to be vocationally oriented, but it does mean that adults need to see how what they are doing now and what they are studying will help them in their career and what they would like to do. It also means that the institution helps them identify a career if they don't know what it is when they enter the institution. The third principle is financing. How flexible is the institution in providing financing for adult learners? We know that federal financial aid does not always support adult learners who are not taking at least a half-time load. What is the institution doing to make up that gap? What is the institution doing with flexible financing? For example, a lot of our adults who come to the institution come with tuition assistance programs from their employers. Very often, the employers will pay after the student successfully completes the course. What happens when the student registers? There's no tuition assistance before you complete the course. How does the institution perhaps take this into account? How does the institution work its financial programs? I'd like to tell a little anecdote about an institution in another state, but a state in the Sacs region, that was really involved in helping adult learners go back to school and earn their degree. And in fact, what they did was set up bursars offices around the campus so that adults could come and pay their tuition bills in a whole variety of places that were easy to access. There was parking in front. If somebody wanted to come at his or her lunch hour, they could just run in, run out. They didn't have to wait. The only problem was at the bursars offices, at which you had to pay in person. There was no provision for paying online. But also the bursars offices were open from 8 to 5, the way the other offices in the college were open. And this was purely because it never occurred to the people used to dealing with traditional students that adults like themselves would have a hard time getting to an office between 8 and 5. Their answer to flexible financial planning was to have the offices open later. So sometimes the answers are very easy, but you need to identify the problem first. The fourth principle is the assessment of learning outcomes, and we talked about that this morning. I think that's what we left the presentation with. Questions about prior learning assessment. How are learning outcomes evaluated? What is the adult being tested on in any course, whether it's a prior learning assessment, whether it's another kind of assessment, but what is going on in any course, what are the learning outcomes that they are required to know, and that will benefit them. And I suppose that when we look at learning outcomes, we're not just looking at adults, we're looking at any student. Principle 5 is the teaching learning process. Does the teaching learning process engage the adult? Is it only one-way lecture, or does the adult have an opportunity to demonstrate some of the kinds of things that he or she has learned and get involved in the class? Student support systems. What about these? Certainly adults have different issues from typical 18 to 22-year-olds. They return to school with a lot of questions. They may be returning students because they didn't have such a successful time the first time around. Not every adult who returns to school after a successful experience. So what kind of support is there for these adults, particularly for adults who may not be on the campus all the time? What do you do about students like those I mentioned, the other SAC state, who run in and out and come to campus but only for a short time? The 7th principle is technology. Does the institution use technology to reach out to learners? Does the institution teach the technology resources to adults? Does the institution ensure that the adults have the resources? For example, in one of the states that administered ALFI to all of its 2-year institutions, there were some institutions that had a real problem because their students did not have access to computers. How were they able to complete surveys for which you needed a computer? They did work around that problem, but they needed to know first that just assuming technology resources is not something you can automatically assume. The 8th principle is strategic partnerships. The institution can't exist in a vacuum. Does it work with other institutions? Does it work with business and industry? Does it work with the military? Does it work with the government locally and perhaps at the state level to develop partnerships that are not simply partnerships for the sake of partnerships, but are strategic partnerships? Are these partnerships that will help the adult learners, perhaps with scholarships, perhaps with internship possibilities, perhaps with recruitment, perhaps with having people from these other organizations come to the institution to be guest lecturers? What kinds of strategic partnerships can the institution arrange with other organizations in the community? And finally, transitions. How does the institution help the adult move from where they were earlier to where they're going to be in the future? How does it help them with transitions? Last week I was talking to a group of people from a program that has been in existence for a long time. It's an urban university, and their adult learner program has been in existence for a very long time, and suddenly light bulbs went off and they said, you know, we need to have a whole program in transitions. It's not enough to help the adult come into the university, but how do we help them throughout their career and also as they leave? When we talk about transitions, we talk about articulation agreements, we talk about transfer, we talk about life and career planning. We talk particularly with the military about how to make the transition from one kind of life to another, perhaps in a different place. And transitions are really crucial. As you might have guessed from what I've said and from things that you may have been thinking, all of the principles are integrated. They are indivisible. They form a whole, and they're imperative. They're not just a good idea. We have found that institutions that do well on the ALFI surveys also do well in helping their students succeed and graduate. And when I talk about the surveys, I'm talking about 2 tools. There is the Institutional Self-Assessment Survey, which CAEL and NCHEMS developed, and there's the Adult Learner Inventory that CAEL and Noah Levitz developed. The first, the Institutional Self-Assessment Survey, is for adult degree programs. It's for faculty, staff, and administrators in those programs. And you can see a sample of some of the questions in your notebook. It's a green sheet. It's in chapter 3. The adult learner inventory is in your notebook in section 3 in its entirety. This is the Knoll-Levitt survey. And what we ask is that institutions have their faculty, staff, and administrators complete the institutional self-assessment survey, which I will refer to as the ISASS from now on, since you know what it is. At the same time, meaning in the same semester, that their students complete the ALI, the Adult Learner Inventory. The ISASS is composed of approximately 50 items, and the institution submits only one survey. So, people have to agree on answers. And what we recommend is that there is a team composed of about 8 to 12 people from the institution who complete the survey. They develop a consensus for the answers. If it's impossible to reach a consensus, they write us a little note that says they can't do it. But the way the survey works best is if they do develop a consensus. And we find that the team and the conversation that the team has is often one of the most important outcomes of the ISASS, as well as the data that are delivered to the institution. What happens is that there is a conversation that's begun among people who typically don't talk to each other about adult learners. They may talk to each other, but not about adult learners. And we recommend that the people who are on this team come from a variety of areas of the institution that do work with adults. For example, faculty, administrators in adult learning programs, the bursar perhaps, the registrar, financial aid, Veterans Affairs, maybe marketing, maybe the admissions office, the library, whole variety of areas in the institution. And this survey can be completed either in paper and pencil version or an electronic version. Here's a sample item from the ISASS. To what extent does your institution partner with other organizations, employers, other post-secondary providers to deliver student support services? Well, one of the reasons I chose this question is because in it you can see that there's a combination of the principle of student support services and the principle of strategic partnerships. And institutions answer questions like this and submit their responses to us. The adult learner inventory, on the other hand, is something that every single student whom you identify completes. And these are adult students whom you identify. Typically, institutions say these are students 25 years of age or over. It is an electronic survey. If you look at the survey that's in your booklet, you'll see that the instructions say it takes 15 to 20 minutes to complete. So it is not an enormous investment of time for the students to complete. The structure is a typical Knoll-Levitt structure. For each question, students give 2 answers. One answer is, how important is this to you on a 7-point scale? The other answer for the very same question is, how satisfied are you with the way your institution is meeting this need? And what is extracted from that is a gap score. The larger the gap, the worse the performance. If the importance is high and the satisfaction is low, there's a large gap, and the institution, in that student's perception, is not performing well. I do need to say, before I forget, that both the ALI and the ISASS are based on perceptions. There is no objective reality out there that says this is what other institutions, it does say this is what other institutions are doing, but it's based on perception. And because people act on the basis of their perception. Okay, this simply reiterates what I just told you. And institutions receive, at the end of all this, different kind of data. Immediately upon the receipt of all of the ALI information from the students, Noel Levitt sends the institution an electronic report of how their students view the institution. I should say that usually there's a 3-week window of time during which students complete the ALI. Noel Levitt takes care of notifying the students that their time is running out, and then they take care of following up if there is any follow-up that's needed with the students. What you get from CAEL is a combination of the various parts of the ALFE assessments. You get a narrative that explains to you what's happening in the reports. You get your institution's institutional self-assessment scores. You get your institution's ALI scores presented in a different format from the format in which they were presented by Noel Levitt. You get comparisons to other institutions. How are you doing compared to other institutions that are similar, that have completed these surveys? And by similar, I mean are either 2-year or 4-year institutions. 2-year institutions are compared to 2-year institutions, 4-year institutions to 4-year institutions. We also will send you an internal comparison of your ISAS and your ALI scores, and I find this the most helpful part. This compares your students' perceptions of your performance on 8 of the 9 principles to your faculty, staff, and administrators' perceptions of your performance. And the reason that students only answer questions related to 8 of the 9 principles is because it's assumed that students really don't know about strategic partnerships. They would not be able to provide any good input when we talk about strategic partnerships. You also will receive a crosswalk of the questions. How do all of the questions on the institutional self-assessment survey relate to all the questions on the ALI? Number 1 does not always line up with number 1. What is the lineup? And the flip side of that, how do the ALI questions line up with the institutional self-assessment questions? You also receive benchmark scores for the principles for all of the ISAS questions, and your institution's scores for the ISAS questions based on the ALFE principles. I want to talk about the benchmark scores for a little bit. We're going to look at some of the reports and get our hands dirty looking at them. Not too dirty, I hope, but in a few minutes. But I did not copy the benchmark scores. The reason is it would be too much paper for everybody to take home. And I don't have a slide of them because there is no possible way that you'd ever see the slide. But let me just tell you that these benchmark scores, both for the maximum benchmark that you could receive and for your own contributions for the benchmarks, have every single, it's a spreadsheet, every single ISAS question is listed, and then across the top, you have a column headed for each of the 9 principles. The maximum contribution packet of benchmarks has what weighted score could you achieve if you were absolutely perfect. Your copy also has what score did you achieve. And we're going to look at some extracted data a little bit later. But you'll see that that way you are able to see not only which principles you may need to work on, but what is it that you need to do within those principles. I mean, it's one thing to say we need to do something more with our student services, then what? Where do you go from there? The data will help you know where to go from there. Okay, now I'd like to distribute some things. Thank you. Before you get a copy that you could look at along with me, I just want to say a few things. These are not hypothetical statistics. These are one of you. Remember I said that some institutions have already done the ALFE. This is one of your campuses. not identified, I hope. And, so these are real data that were sent to one of the institutions that's in this room. Okay? And what that institution received was first the ISAS summary. And the ISAS summary has, along the left-hand side of the page, we have two more up here if anybody needs two more. Thank you. All the principals are listed along the left-hand side of the page. Then the institution receives its score, and this is based on 100. There is the mean score that has been obtained by 45 institutions. This institution was compared to 45 similar institutions. And when you do the survey, if you'd like the names of the institutions to which your institution has been compared, we'll be glad to give it to you. We won't tell you their scores, but we can tell you what the comparable institutions are. And these are other institutions that have completed the ALFI surveys. Then there is the highest score. What would you have to do to score the best of all of these institutions? What was the lowest score? And what's your rank order? Okay? Then we also send you your comparisons to the mean performance. If you look at this, you'll see that this institution in support services, it's a little mushed together, but that's because one of the scores is 41.2 and the other is 41.1. This institution scored at the mean in ranking, and below the mean in the other areas. I'm going to go back to this first page. I'd like to talk a little bit more about this first page. Remember, these are perceptions of the faculty, staff, and administrators at this institution. They agreed on the answers that they submitted on the ALFI survey, on the ISAS. And according to them, they didn't score in the top 10. There was only one score in which they ranked compared to the other institutions in the top half, and that was support services. Their ranking is 21. And so they perceive themselves as doing, well, sort of the average, in a little lower than the other institutions in student support services. There are 45 institutions altogether. One of their scores is 39. They rank themselves 39th in finance and how they're serving the students with flexible financial programs. Okay? And then you can see the variation in between. We also will show you the best performance. This is the institution compared to the best performance of schools. And here you can see if this institution were concerned about being the very best, they would probably want to look not so much at the top of the bars in the bar graph, but they would want to look at the spaces between. What kind of a difference is there in their performance compared to the best institution? And here you could see that with regard to finance, there's about a 20-point gap. So the best institution is doing significantly better than they. But there are other gaps as well that they would want to look at. To repeat what I said earlier, when this institution looked at their scores, they see that according to their faculty, staff, and administrators, they're doing pretty well in student support services. Not doing so well in finance. And there is a pretty big spread. I mean, I need to tell you that typically the spread that we find for faculty, staff, and administrators is greater than the spread that we find for students. And this may be because the faculty, staff, and administrators can make finer discriminations among what the activities that they are doing. So when we rank how the institution did, what it was doing best in and what it was doing least well in, what we find is that support services is an area that they thought they're doing pretty well in, that in the teaching learning process, they're doing the next best, and that in life career planning and assessment and strategic partnerships, there's kind of a tie somewhere around the middle, and they're doing least well in outreach and finance. Okay, and this is one institution, and these are their real scores, ranks. If we look at the ALI summary, remember these are the students at the institution. And again, the principals are listed along the left, and there are only 8 of them because strategic partnerships is not part of that. Once again, we're looking at the gap score. What's the gap between how important this is to the students and how well they think this need is being served? There is the mean gap for each of these principles, the highest gap, which is not great. Big gap is not good. The lowest gap, and then the rank order for this institution. One of the interesting things is that the students were harder on the institution than the faculty, staff, and administrators. That the highest rank is 27 of the 45. And if we look at the ALI mean performance, what you get is the mean performance of other institutions and your performance. And so for each of these principles, there are 2 measures. Remember, there's the importance and the satisfaction. So that's why there are a lot of bars in this chart. Once again, excuse me, we see the ALI best performance and the institution's performance, so they could see how they compare to the best ranks that there are. And with regard to the students, we find that there was a tie for the first place. Even though it was a ranking of 27 out of 45, the students ranked this institution's best performance as assessment and the teaching learning process. My guess is that this is an institution that allows CLEP credit, ACE recommendations applied to the degree, perhaps challenge tests, and prior learning assessment to be applied to the degree. The students see that assessment ranks really high. They also see that the teaching learning process ranks high. Their lowest scores are for finance and for transitions. And what you see is that they don't agree with the faculty, staff, and administrators on everything. Faculty, staff, and administrators ranked student support services as the area in which they were doing the best. They do agree that finance is an area that probably needs to be worked on because both groups rank this kind of low. Which leads me to talk to you about the rankings of the ALI. We talked about the highest assessment in the teaching learning process, the lowest finance and transitions, and what falls in the middle. And I just want to go back to the last slide to say that here we see that the range is not all that great. The students ranked the institution from 27th to 38th, whereas the institution itself had a larger range from the 21st to the 39th. And remember I said that for me, the most important part of the data comes when you look at the comparisons of the student rankings and the faculty, staff, and administrators rankings. And I need to say that this is graphic, but I'm not sure that it tells us all that much. What we do find is that the faculty is more, in this way, more critical just in terms of the numbers than the students, but this doesn't really speak to me. What does speak to me is this kind of internal comparison. And if you have done the ALC surveys, I recommend that you do this if you haven't already. I find it extremely helpful in planning strategic next steps. What do you do after you get these data? I mean, how can you make your money work for you? What I did simply was to take the two charts that I showed you earlier, the rankings of the ISAS and of the ALI within the institution, and I just set them up so that the institutional self-assessment survey shows that support services are being done really well in the perception of the faculty, staff, and administrators. And then we go on down the line. Teaching learning process, technology, transitions, life career planning, assessment, strategic partnerships, and I assigned them all the same number because they tied, those three, outreach, and finance. When I look at the students, I have a different order and progression. We have assessment, teaching learning process, technology, life career planning, support services, outreach, finance, and transitions. And I need to say something about this institution. Life and career planning is the third highest. We had a tie for the first, and then the second, and life and career planning. That's unusual. I think that in your packet, you have a Noel Levitt's report of the latest ALI. It has a little brown edge. Mary Ellen is holding it up. Typically, students are least happy with life and career planning. And I think that's really important for working with adults in general and also certainly working with the military and veterans particularly. What can you do to help them see how their education and their career are related? How do these work together? This institution is doing a better job than most. Their students are pretty satisfied with life career planning that's going on there. They're not all that satisfied, however, with outreach, finance, and transitions. And I do want to point out that these are the students who were there who are not so satisfied with outreach. What about all the others who weren't there for whom outreach was not successful? So if I were at this institution, even though outreach isn't in the bottom, I would certainly give that some thought and consideration. So when we go back to look at the lineup, you'll see that some of the strengths of this institution are the teaching and learning process. Both the students, these are the adult students, and the faculty, staff, and administrators rank these pretty high. That's a strength of the institution. If we look at life and career planning, that's also a strength because even though it ranks lower for the faculty, staff, and administrators, it's kind of in the middle and it's not at the bottom, and life and career planning is so important for adults, it makes sense to consider this a strength. And another strength is technology, which also ranks up there. Okay? So this is the way I would begin to analyze the data if I were at this institution. The institutional challenges, as we have said, are outreach, which ranks low for the faculty, staff, and administrators, and I said kind of low for the students, and also finance, which is toward the bottom for both groups. That's not all of it. There's some discrepancies that I think this institution needs to confront. Support services and transitions. If we look at support services, the faculty, staff, and administrators rank it pretty high. Students don't. And if we look at transitions, the same thing happens. The students rank it last, and the faculty, staff, and administrators rank it much higher. I think those are some things that this institution needs to consider. And how are they going to consider it? We'll talk about it a little bit later, but support services and transitions are also two of the main principles that make sense for veterans. What kind of support services are these people getting at the institution, particularly if they are strangers to the institution and to the programs that are offered? And what about the transitions? As we said earlier, it's a major transition to go from the military to the institution. I would just briefly like to say that when we talk about serving veterans, just as I said earlier, the support services and transitions are related to everybody. So are all of the CAEL principles. If we look at these principles, there are ways of putting them into action for all of the veterans. When I mentioned the contribution report, that Excel spreadsheet that says what activities are related to what questions, you'll be able to see that you can tailor whatever you do to meet the needs of various subgroups of your adult learners. And I was going to talk about the activities that we're talking about. So I pulled out some ideas from the contribution spreadsheet. If we're looking at support services, one of the activities is that the institution emphasizes its commitment to serving adult learners in its position descriptions and hiring procedures. That's a student service. Are the people, like the dean, made to know that serving adult learners is an important part of the mission of this institution? The maximum contribution that can be made here is a 2. This institution, the real life one, had 0. What about the student affairs staff? The maximum contribution is 4. This institution scored 0. And those are their own answers. Nobody from outside said, how are you doing this? We're going to check off. These are their own answers of their perceptions of how they are providing support services to adult learners. Another one is how important is your commitment to adult learners made in your publications? What about your unit mission? Does that mention serving adult learners? Again, the maximum contribution they could have earned was a 2. This institution scored 0. And what about your website? Does that emphasize serving adult learners? Again, the maximum contribution was 2, and this institution scored a 1. So they do something with regard to serving adult learners and make it clear on their website. And what I really want to emphasize, sort of as a sidebar, go back home and look at your websites and see if you do talk about serving adult learners. There's one institution that I was at a few months ago, and before I went, I tried to see what their website said about adult learners, and I typed in adult learners and didn't get anything. I typed in adults, and I found out all about the services that they provide to the parents of their students when they come for orientation. But I didn't find out anything about adult learners at that institution. So check it out. Pretend that you are somebody from the outside trying to see what the institution is doing. when we talk about student services, remember I said there was also a crosswalk. What does the question on the ISAS correspond to in a question on the ALI? For example, here's a question. Which of the following statements best characterizes your institution's overall approach to providing student support services? And one of them is a proactive approach, that the institution continuously monitors the students, and the other is more laissez-faire. They provide information to the students and let them go figure it out. And the question for the students was, when I miss a deadline or fall behind in my studies, someone from the institution contacts me. And this is the kind of pairing that you'll get in the crosswalk. I just want to mention that there is an institution that we worked with that had a big discrepancy in finance. The faculty, staff, and administrators thought they did a lot with regard to finance. They had information, they had scholarships available. The students ranked it really low, and we couldn't figure out what the reason for the discrepancy was. And the faculty, staff, and administrators said, we put all the information in the admissions packets. We have brochures all over the campus in different offices. We don't know why the students don't know about it. And they say we're doing a bad job. We really do have very generous financial support for our adult students. And the adults said, we are so excited about being admitted to this institution, and we're so nervous, we can't read everything in the admissions packet. We put it away for later, and later never comes. In addition, we're so busy, when we run into an office, we don't have time to browse. So there was this major disconnect. The school really was doing a good job. The students ranked it low because they didn't know about it. And that's one way in which knowing the questions and how to address them and how to talk about them to the students can really help. I need to say that that institution changed what it does. It now has a required orientation for adult learners, so that the adults who come to the institution know what some of the benefits are and what their options are. In this question, if I were at this institution, one of the things I would do would be to do the crosswalk, and I would also look at question 49 and see that the maximum contribution for the service delivery that I just talked about is 10, and what this institution does was nothing. So what are you going to do when you get all this information? Well, one of the things you certainly can do is publicize your strengths. The ALFI is not only to find out what your challenges are, but it's also to see what your strengths are. This institution certainly has a strength in the teaching learning process, and adults really care about the teaching learning process. They care that their learning is valued. They care that they may have some hands-on experiences. They care that the learning is integrated into what they're doing. That's really important, and this should be a strength that's publicized. Secondly, technology is a strength. That's another strength that should be publicized, and if this institution looks at the crosswalk and looks at the contribution scores, they'll be able to see what it is specifically that they're doing that gets agreement from both students and faculty, staff, and administrators that they're doing a good job. And finally, life career planning. As I said, life career planning typically is an area that does not do very well among students. Students at this institution are pretty well satisfied with life career planning. This may be one way in which this institution can create a niche for itself and in some ways distinguish itself from other institutions in the area. So certainly looking at the strengths in the ALFI is one way to use the results. The other is to prioritize your challenges. There are 9 principles to effectively serving adult learners. You can't do all at once. You can't do all well at once. You need to know where to start and what to do when you start that. So this institution could certainly prioritize its challenges and start with finance and outreach. Maybe the discrepancy in, well, no, I take that back. Maybe some of the discrepancies can be due to miscommunication. The reason I took it back was because for a minute I forgot that they both scored low on finance. But finance and outreach are certainly two areas that this institution could profitably look at with regard to recruiting and retaining its adult learners. And one of the things to do when addressing the challenges, as I said, is to look at one principle at a time, to look at the various scores. There are a lot of data that you receive, and you can use these data to develop a strategic plan and then assess progress. Strategic plan doesn't help very much if you're not checking your progress against the benchmarks. Then there are other areas where we said there is a room for additional data analysis, support services and transitions. With support services, the institution ranked itself 1, and the learners ranked at 4. Transitions, the institution ranked itself 4, and students ranked at 7. I think if I were going to work on these, I would flip the order, and I would look at transitions first because it is down farther in the rankings for both groups. Again, if I were analyzing the data, I would look at the contribution report to see what activities I could identify related to these, and I would absolutely convene focus groups of faculty, staff, and administrators, and the students. Again, I would develop a strategic plan, and then I would assess progress. You're not the first institutions to do the adult learner focused institution surveys. As we've said, there were about 45 in this category. There are about 47 in the other category. So we're talking about 100 institutions who've used these versions of the adult learner focused inventory. What have some of the institutions done? Well, in terms of outreach, they've offered classes in a new format. They've looked at their website and perhaps redesigned it. As I mentioned, some have required orientation or redesigned it, or they've had a non-credit program to help adults transition. Some cost-free things that institutions have done. They have set up student mentor programs that have helped new students become accustomed to the institution. One of the things they've done is have mandatory advisory training for faculty. Are your faculty used to dealing with traditional students only? Do they know about adult learners and how adult learners may have different needs from younger students? There are many institutions where faculty are advisors for their discipline, but they don't know about advising adult learners. So this is something that some institutions have done. The committee that was first convened to look at the ISAS, the Institutional Self-Assessment Survey, can become a standing adult learner committee. And there is more than one institution that has done this. There are committees that have been charged by the president to look at adult learner progress, and these committees are composed of the very people who were on that first committee, who began the conversation and who continue it. If, for example, your institution is concerned about serving the military and veterans, by all means, have the person in charge of Veterans Affairs participate in the ISAS to begin the conversation. What about the person in financial aids or the admissions person? What does the admissions person say to adult learners to encourage them to return to the campus? Other institutions have had articulation agreements with surrounding institutions, 2-year, 4-year, perhaps institutions that, like hospitals, that might offer programs that are academic in nature, and this helps with transitions. And then certainly institutions have used the data to form strategic plans and baseline reviews. Another thing that institutions have done, excuse me, is to use the data for internal marketing. for letting people at their institution know how they are serving adult learners, what they still need to do to serve adult learners, and that they perhaps need funds to do some of these services for adult learners. There was a piece on the CAEL website for a while that talked about using the data to make an argument for increased funds for adult learner programs because there was then information on which to base those requests. Northwestern State University in Louisiana is an institution that has used the adult learner-focused institution surveys. They've used it more than once. They're currently using it to assess their progress. And Dr. Darlene Williams says that it's also been used as a marketing tool, which is what I tried to say before. Some of the ways that you can get more information about the ISAS and the ALFI, thank you, is to look at the CAEL website, which is easy. It's just www.cael.org. And there you will click on to colleges and universities, and from there you can click on to adult student services. In your booklet, you have the publication that I mentioned. It's Duty, Honor, Country, and Credit. Not only does it talk to you about how perhaps to serve the military and veterans, but it also has a lot of resources that you might be able to use. And it also tells you what people are doing that meet the ALFI principles to serve veterans. And then I do want to say that you have a friend at CAEL, and if you have any questions, please contact me. This is my contact information. And as I said, I will leave the slides. I'll send the slides to Mary Ellen, and you could have all the information that you could refer to if you'd like to find out more about ALFI or the principles of effectively serving adult learners. Thank you.